My name is Joy. You saw me last week. I'm here again. I love teaching in this context. I love getting to be with you and studying God's Word together. And I'm sad that we're coming to the end of this book, this long journey through land, first the fighting for the land and then the land allotments, and now we are into Joshua's final words to the leaders, to the people. There's a little bit of a sadness to this, bittersweetness to the end of something. And I actually love that there are so many sweet parallels between this text and the first chapter of Joshua. I don't know if you noticed it. There is this remembering of how God called Joshua to be strong, be courageous, to lead the people well, to fight well with the people, all while depending on God's strength. God's ability to lead him, God's ability to enable him in the work that he had to do. And now this is Joshua recognizing that he is old, he is going to be going away, and he's commissioning this next generation of leaders to take up the task, to keep going in what God has given them. There's always a bit of a tension in transition. A few years ago when Jeff Bucknam was leaving Northview, some of you know him, some of you have come here after him, but he was a big leader in our church. And there was this question as he was leading, what is Northview going to look like without Jeff here? Are the people going to continue to be faithful with the word that God has given them, with the lives that Jeff had led us to hold fast to? Would the people continue to serve God in the same ways? And when Jeff left, he had this commission, he had this call to the people of Northview, the leaders of Northview, to be faithful with God, what God had given them, to continue in the ways that they had started. So he left them with this call to faithfulness. And Joshua here too is calling the people to remember how God has been faithful with them, to continue in that, and then also reminding them of the consequences of not following God well. So that's kind of what we're going to frame our conversation on today. This remembering that God fought your enemies, and so cling to him. And we're going to frame this in three ways. First, remembering that he has won. And then remembering to cling to him. So cling to him. And then don't cling to sin. Those are our three ideas we're going to frame this around. So first one, remember he has won. In verses 1 to 2 it says, "A long time after, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from their surrounding enemies, and Joshua was old and well advanced in years, Joshua summoned all Israel, its elders and heads, its judges, and its officers." So these are the leaders of Israel. And there's a tension here in that there's no one person who's taking this on. Joshua's not giving one person the command to lead Israel after this. He's leaving this with all of the leaders of Israel. So he has some firm words for them as they go and they lead Israel. He says this to them. He says, "I am now old and well advanced in years," even more old than the last time he spoke. He says, "And I have seen, and you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. For it is the Lord your God who has fought for you. Behold, I have allotted to you as an inheritance for your tribes those nations that remain, along with all the nations that I have already cut off, from the Jordan to the great sea in the west. The Lord your God will push them back before you and drive them out of your sight, and you shall possess their land, just as the Lord promised you." So it's this big call to remember. Remember the past work of God, that he has driven out the nations around you. And remember the present work of God, that there are still nations to fight, that he will enable you to fight and win. And there's the future promise of God, that he will push out the nations, that he will do all that he has promised to do. So we have past, present, and future things to remember at this time. And this is actually the same thing we do when we celebrate communion. When we celebrate communion, we have a past that we are being reminded of. The fact that Christ has won the battle. He has defeated sin and death. And we no longer need to fear those things. And there's a present reminder, a reminder that we are still in a struggle, that we still need to be reconciled to one another. We still need to fight the sin in our lives, and we need the Spirit's help to fight that sin. And there is a future reminder that we have a future with Christ, that he will come back and we will have the opportunity to spend eternity with him. So communion is our reminder that prepares us for the lives that we are to live. It's sort of the locker room pep talk before a team goes out and plays their sport. It's this: remember what you are, how you are, who you are, in order to be able to go and do your best. See, God has proven himself faithful in so many ways in all of the book of Joshua. And it is this that should enable us to trust him. I'm not sure where I heard it, but somebody told me once that trust is built on three things. It is built on consistency, it's built on ability, and it's built on willingness. So if any of those three things are missing, then you can't really trust someone. If they are consistent and willing but not able, well, you can't actually count on them to do what you've asked them to do. If they're willing and able but not consistent, you can't really trust them to show up when they need to show up. And if they're consistent and able but not willing, well, they're not going to want to show up. But we see in this that God has shown himself consistent to fight every battle for Israel. He's shown himself able to stop the sun in its path, to bring down hail, to pull the Jordan back 5 kilometers. He is able to do what his people need. And he is willing. He has given so many good promises to his people. There is nothing in him that is holding back from following through on what he has for his people, so they can trust him, just like we can trust him in that he has been faithful with everything in our lives as well. He has shown himself trustworthy, and we can trust him. And this is what Joshua is trying to instill in the people. You can trust God. Remember he has won. Remember his faithfulness, and then let that lead you to cling to him. That is our second point. So cling to God. And verses 9 through 13, he says this: Therefore be very strong to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right hand nor to the left, that you may not mix with these other nations remaining among you, or make mention of the names of their gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you shall cling to the Lord your God, just as you have done to this day. That was verse 6 through 8, not 9 through 13. But there's this picture here of clinging to God and this description of what it looks like. This being strong to obey, to do all the works that God has called them to do, and not loosening their grip on those commands. The picture I get when I hear that word cling is a little girl that has just latched herself on to her dad's leg. She's just holding on to that leg, and nothing will make her let it go. And when she is holding on to that, she's actually forced to go the same way that her dad is going. That clinging enables her to continue in the way that her father is leading her. And if she lets go of that, there's this possibility that she will get hurt, that she won't be able to keep going in where her father is going. See, there's this call here. God is saying to cling to his ways so that you will keep going in his ways. Don't fall off. Don't go astray. So this is what clinging to God looks like. And then there's this picture of what it doesn't look like. It looks like following after these other nations, following after their other gods. And in your homework, you would have seen that this isn't just about intermarriage. This isn't about God not wanting them to associate with the other nations. It's about Israel's heart. God knows that if they go and they associate with all of these other people, there's this possibility that those other people will draw them away from God, will cause them to sin, will cause them to worship other gods. And so he actually cares about their hearts and wants them to continue in the fight. So he says, don't put yourself in a compromising position. This is his encouragement. Don't let yourself be compromised. But then he also shows God's enablement in the fight. He says in verses 9 through 10, "For the Lord has driven out before you a great and strong nation. And as for you, no man has been able to stand before you this day. One man of you puts to flight 1,000, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you, just as he promised you." So one of those men might have thought, as they are swinging that sword, that they were the one that was doing it. But in reality, it is God who is doing the fight through them. In the same way, in our fight, it is God who is doing it through us. We may feel like we are the ones in the battle, but it is actually God in us that is enabling us to fight that battle. Instead of us just clinging to our Father's leg, our Father is holding on to us and carrying us in the way he wants us to go. Joshua has one final call for them in this portion. He says, "Be very careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God." And also in your homework, you saw that it is actually the love of God that leads us to obey him. And it is a reflection of our obedience is a reflection of our love of him. See, I've worked for companies that I really loved, and I've worked for companies that I really, well, not hated, but genuinely disliked. And when I really loved the place that I was working, I had a genuine desire to follow the rules, follow the things that they had put in place, and do what they had asked me to do. And when I was working for a place that I didn't love and I did not trust the things that they had for me, then there was this desired not to do what they had for me, desired not to do what they called me to do. See, in my love and trust for the place, there's a willingness that comes with this. Same with my dad. I know he loves me, and I know I love him. And there's a trust that is in that relationship. So when he tells me to go change the oil on my car, I know that it is in my best interest. I know the things he's going to ask me to do are for my benefit because I love him, because I trust him, and I know that he is good. In the same way, our God is good. He is trustworthy. And so the things he calls us to do should be our response of love because we know he has our good in mind. This should enable us to love him and trust him and obey him. An example of how I've had to experience obedience to him. In the past, I had a friend who hurt me in a difficult and emotional way. I was worried. I thought I had lost that friendship, and it made me lose a lot of sleep. I didn't sleep, but as I spent those nights praying, I had this deep sense of trust that God had built in me over a long period of time, of showing himself faithful in my life that I could not have conjured for myself. In those nights while I prayed, I had this deep sense that even if my world fell apart, I could trust that God would carry me through it. At that same time that friend hurt me, I knew my act of obedience would have to be to forgive, even though I was hurt. And I saw God work powerfully to redeem that situation, to show that he was trustworthy and that our relationship could be restored as long as I was obedient to forgive. It is often when our world is falling apart that it is most difficult to lean into obedience and trust the God that loves us. And yet that is the point where he most shows himself faithful. So, let your love of God lead to your obedience to him, and let him show himself faithful in your life as well. Joshua has given this call to Israel to remember God's faithfulness and to cling to him. And then he's also saying, don't cling to sin. There's this harsh warning at the end of this text. We see in verses 12 to 13, for if you turn back and cling to the remnant of these nations remaining among you, and make marriages with them so that you associate with them and they with you, know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you, but they shall be a snare and a trap for you, a whip on your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from off the good ground that the Lord your God has given you. Joshua gives us an illustration of what sin can do to us. It is like a trap. It is a whip. It is thorns. I grabbed some very lovely clip art illustrations for us. This is what Joshua's saying it looks like. But yeah, so I don't know if you know what a snare is, but that picture on the top left, that is a snare trap. And even the very silly depiction of the person holding the other person, that is another type of snare, another type of trap. But you can see both of these are going to hold on to you and keep you from going in the way that you are supposed to go. So these are both going to cling to you and keep you from what you're supposed to. And then the consequences of that is that whip, that thorn, that thing that holds on to you and traps you and causes you continuous pain. See, God is saying that our sin, the sin that we might be led into, causes us continual pain. This is not something that we can brush aside. This is not something that's just fine. It's something that causes us continual pain. So he's saying, don't get trapped in it. Don't go and hug the thorn bush. This is not going to be good for you. And then he has one more reminder of God's promises. He says, and now I am about to go the way of all the earth, and you know in your hearts and souls, all of you, that not one word has failed of all the good things that the Lord your God has promised concerning you. All have come to pass for you. Not one of them has failed. Is this deep reminder, God has fulfilled his promises. He has been faithful. You can trust him. But there's also the warning. But just as all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you have been fulfilled for you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the evil things until he has destroyed you from off this good land that the Lord your God has given you. If you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and you shall perish quickly from off the good land that he has given you. This very stark warning. If you transgress, if you follow after these other nations, God's anger will burn against you, and you will perish, you will die. These are the consequences. This is what might happen to you if you fall away, if you are drawn away by the people around you. And I think we all know how easy it is to be drawn away by the people around us. My own confession time, a few years ago I worked in a space where the culture was to just really bash our management. And it was really easy to feel like you were connecting with the other women in that space by just bad talking those who were above us. And to be fair, there were things that could have been better. But in that gossip, in that slander, all we did was build up bitterness and resentment for the people that were in management. And honestly, it didn't actually make me any closer to the people in that space. So the consequences of my sin was bitterness in relationships with those above me, and actually not really solid relationships with those around me. In following after what everybody else had for me, there were consequences. There was broken relationships. And we know that this is the truth with all of sin. If you lean into anger, that's just going to lead to destruction. If you lean into comparison, that's going to lead to jealousy. And all of these lead to broken relationship. The reality is sin has consequences. And sin is actually deserving of the wrath of God. It's deserving of death. These are the consequences we deserve when we sin. And yet Christ took all of these consequences. This picture of a trap, of a whip of thorn, it all reminds me of what Christ did right before, what Christ took right before the cross. We see in Mark 15:17-20, they clothed him in a purple cloak and twisted together a crown of thorns, and they put it on him. They began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put on his own clothes on him. And they led him out to crucify him. Jesus was trapped by those who should have been his friends, who should have followed him. He had thorns put in his eyes. He took the punishment of the whip. He took the consequences that we deserved for our sin, that we might be declared righteous. He has cleansed us of all of these things, and now we do not need to fear the wrath of God. We don't actually need to fear death. But we do need to fight sin. We are cleansed from our sin, but we are still in the reality of the now and not yet. The world that we live in here that is still broken and full of difficulty and sorrow. We still have to fight ourselves and the world around us. And sin rarely has easy, quick fixes. There are cases, there are times where we hand it over to God and God simply frees us of that sin, but often it is more like a thorn that has dug itself deep. And we actually need a lot of time and help to pull that thorn out of us. We need God's Spirit to do the work, to dig it out. And we actually need each other to hold us accountable. See, Joshua wasn't speaking to a single person here. He's speaking to an entire nation. He's speaking to the leaders of an entire nation who are going to have to keep their people accountable. In the same way, when we deal with sin, we actually need each other to keep each other going, to hold us, to help us rip those thorns out of our own skin. But it begins with repentance. It begins with giving it to God. We need to lay out how we have failed to him and also run from it, recognizing that clinging to sin will only lead to our detriment. Whatever your struggle is today, whatever your sin is that you are fighting against today, God is reminding you. He's reminding you in this text that he has won the battle. He has won the battle against sin and death. And in the same way that he fought and won the war against Israel's enemies, he has fought and won your war against sin, against death, against this world. Israel received their good inheritance of the land, but we actually get a better inheritance. We get Christ's righteousness, and we get eternity with him. So today, I'm asking you to trust God, to cling to him in every aspect of your life, and to run far from the sin that would ensnare you.